HOA were meant to protect the neighborhood, but for Emily, they became a cage. It started with a small letter in her mailbox. HO, a notice of violation. Your front door color is not approved. Emily blinked. She had painted her door soft lavender. The neighborhood was full of beige, gray, and cream doors, but lavender. Was it really a crime? She looked closer at the letter. HOA had fined her $350 immediately. Shock turned to disbelief. Her neighbor, Mr. Thompson, had installed a giant inflatable flamingo in his yard, towering at 12 feet. Yet HOA did nothing. Frustration bubbled inside her. She remembered her friend Sarah telling her about HOA fines gone wrong, neighbors paying thousands for trivial things. Emily's mind raced. She couldn't be the only victim. She had to investigate. The next day, she attended the HOA board meeting. What she found left her reeling. Mr. Randall, the board president, smiled at the room as he casually announced another mandatory fee. HOA Community Enhancement Fee. $2,500 per household for landscaping improvements. Gasps filled the room. Everyone whispered, stunned by the sudden cost. Emily's heart pounded. She realized HOA was exploiting its power. This wasn't about neighborhood beauty, it was about money. She discovered that one of the board members had secretly profited from the landscaping contract. HOA money was being funneled directly to a private company owned by a board member's cousin. She felt a mixture of fear and anger, but Emily wasn't alone. Sarah, her neighbor, had secretly recorded the board's previous meetings and hidden documents revealing illegal fines. Emily knew what she had to do. That night, she combed through HOA records in her dimly lit living room. Each page made her blood boil. Unjust fines, inconsistent rules, preferential treatment for certain neighbors. Every line screamed corruption. Her plan began to form: expose the HOA fraud, rally the community, and reclaim their money. Days passed. Emily posted anonymous tips on neighborhood forums. HOA members started whispering, worried about leaks. Emily received an unexpected email. HOA had hired a private investigator to identify the whistleblower. Fear gripped her, but Emily's resolve hardened. She had to go further. She decided to film hidden cameras during board meetings. Every sneaky conversation, every under-the-table deal captured. HOA had no idea Emily was onto them. Week by week, the tension escalated. Fines kept piling. Emily and Sarah strategized, connecting with neighbors who had suffered minor but costly violations. Together, they created a network of evidence. One of the board members, Mr. Randall, turned out to be Emily's estranged uncle. HOA had unknowingly put her in direct confrontation with family. The room of board members was filled with smug faces, thinking no one could challenge their authority. But Emily had a secret weapon, irrefutable proof. HOA was about to face its reckoning. By now, Emily's emotions had taken over: anger, determination, fear, and a strange thrill of justice. She knew one mistake could ruin everything. HOA would fight back, but she was ready. HOA was not going to back down easily. Emily knew that exposing the board's corruption would trigger retaliation, but she felt a surge of determination. She spent the next morning organizing her notes and recordings. Each piece of evidence, from unjust fines to illegal financial maneuvers, was meticulously cataloged. HOA documents sprawled across the dining table, highlighted and annotated, while the laptop displayed hidden video footage of the board's secret meetings. Emily called Sarah to strategize. Together, they compiled a list of neighbors affected by HOA decisions. Some had paid thousands for trivial violations, while others had been silently intimidated. Each person brought another layer to the unfolding plan. The following evening, Emily walked through the neighborhood, speaking quietly with residents in their backyards, on porches, and by their driveways. HOA had no idea that its once silent victims were beginning to unite. Meanwhile, Mr. Randall prepared for his own counterattack. He arranged a meeting with the board in the community hall, discussing strategies to suppress dissent, but the board underestimated the reach of Emily's careful coordination. HOA had misjudged her patience, her intelligence, and her courage. Emily's evidence grew more compelling. She created visual charts showing exactly how HOA money was diverted to private accounts, how fines were inconsistent, and which board members personally benefited. These charts would later become pivotal in convincing skeptical neighbors to join her cause. The tension escalated when the board decided to hold a surprise inspection of several homes, targeting properties that had previously received minor violations. Emily and Sarah monitored the inspections from a distance, noting every irregularity. HOA inspectors made arbitrary calls, issuing warnings without explanation, confirming Emily's suspicions of systematic abuse. One evening, Emily discovered a hidden clause in the HOA bylaws that allowed the board to increase fees without a vote if deemed necessary for community improvement. She realized the loophole was being exploited, turning every minor disagreement into a potential profit stream for the board. Determined to act, Emily organized a discreet meeting with a small group of neighbors. They planned to attend the next official board meeting en masse, armed with evidence, personal accounts, and video recordings. HOA was about to face a united front it had never anticipated. The day of the meeting arrived. Emily's pulse quickened as she stepped into the community hall. The board, oblivious to the crowd of prepared residents, began the session with its usual formalities. HOA members smiled confidently, unaware that their authority was about to be challenged. Emily's voice was steady as she presented the documented abuses, detailing every fine, payment, and secret agreement. Neighbor after neighbor spoke, sharing experiences of frustration, fear, and financial loss caused by HOA mismanagement. The room buzzed with tension and disbelief. Mr. Randall attempted to dismiss the claims, but the evidence was irrefutable. Emily showcased videos, charts, and personal testimonies. HOA could no longer control the narrative. By the end of the meeting, a decision was made: an independent audit of HOA finances, a temporary freeze on all fines, and the formation of a committee to oversee fair enforcement. Emily's meticulous planning and courage had shifted the balance of power. Walking home that evening, Emily felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The neighborhood was not perfect yet, but the message was clear: HOA could not exploit its residents unchecked. Unity, persistence, and courage had turned the tide. As Emily looked at her lavender door, she allowed herself a small smile. The fight was far from over, but she had taken the first decisive step. HOA would think twice before underestimating the community again. HOA was starting to realize that Emily's efforts were more organized than they had anticipated. But the board wasn't ready to give up without a fight. Emily spent the next few days coordinating with more neighbors. She collected additional evidence: old emails, photographs of violations that had been exaggerated, and even receipts proving unnecessary charges. HOA had unknowingly strengthened her case with every unfair action. One afternoon, Emily received an anonymous tip about a secret meeting among the board members at a nearby cafe. She and Sarah decided to go, keeping a safe distance while observing. HOA members spoke in hushed tones about strategies to regain control, unaware that every word was being noted for later exposure. Back at her home, Emily organized the growing mountain of data. Charts, videos, and personal testimonies were carefully cross-referenced. HOA would soon face evidence that was impossible to dispute. Tensions in the neighborhood were high. Some residents were nervous about speaking out, fearing retaliation. Emily encouraged them, reminding everyone that unity was their strength. HOA could only intimidate if the community remained divided. The next board meeting approached. Emily and Sarah had prepared a detailed presentation, showing exactly how HOA money was being misused and fines issued unfairly. Each neighbor's experience reinforced the narrative. When the meeting began, the board tried to maintain composure, but the room was filled with determined residents ready to confront every abuse. HOA could feel the shift in power. Emily started presenting evidence. Graphs, screenshots, and recorded meetings clearly illustrated corruption and mismanagement. Neighbor after neighbor added their stories, each one painting a picture of frustration, fear, and financial burden caused by HOA overreach. The board attempted to argue, but Emily anticipated every defense. Calmly, she countered each point with facts and documentation. HOA members were visibly shaken. By the end of the meeting, the board agreed to several measures. Independent audit of finances, halt on all current fines until investigation complete, formation of a fair enforcement committee including residents. Emily felt a surge of relief and triumph. HOA had been forced to acknowledge the community's voice. Walking home that evening, she passed her lavender door and paused. The fight had been exhausting but meaningful. Residents smiled at each other, sharing quiet words of gratitude. Emily knew the neighborhood had changed, not just in rules but in spirit. HOA would no longer have unchecked power, and the unity she had helped create would protect the community for years to come. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the street. Emily took a deep breath, feeling proud of the courage and persistence that had led to this moment. HOA had learned a lesson, and the neighborhood had reclaimed its voice. HOA was slowly realizing that the community had found its voice and the board's authority was no longer absolute, but Emily knew vigilance was necessary. Power could shift back if the residents grew complacent. The following morning, Emily walked through the neighborhood, noting subtle changes. Neighbors were more confident, chatting openly on their lawns. Children played freely without fear of arbitrary restrictions. HOA had already begun to lose its grip, but Emily wanted to ensure that the shift would last. At her home, she and Sarah continued organizing evidence for potential future actions. While the board had agreed to reforms, Emily wanted to make sure no loopholes remained. HOA records were meticulously examined, revealing minor inconsistencies that could have caused future disputes. Meanwhile, Mr. Randall tried to regain control. The board planned a community announcement, hoping to intimidate residents subtly. Emily attended the gathering, notebook in hand, observing each move. HOA members attempted to project confidence, but their attempts at authority felt forced and hollow. During the announcement, Emily noticed a few residents hesitating. She discreetly encouraged them, reminding them that their voices mattered and their unity was powerful. HOA could influence those who doubted themselves, but strength lay in shared resolve. Emily also discovered that some of the older, long-term neighbors had kept old correspondence showing repeated abuses by HOA. She included these in her ongoing documentation, ensuring that the entire history of violations would be clear. Weeks passed, and Emily continued subtle monitoring. She maintained a careful balance, not confronting unnecessarily but always documenting. HOA was aware that their influence had diminished, but no one could yet predict the extent of the community's coordination. One evening, Emily and Sarah hosted a small neighborhood meeting at her backyard. They discussed plans for community activities, creating shared responsibility and collaboration among residents. HOA had no legal claim over the social gatherings, but this strengthened bonds and empowered the community further. As the sun set, Emily reflected on how far they had come. The lavender door seemed brighter, the neighborhood livelier. HOA would not be able to control them as before, and Emily understood that vigilance, unity, and careful planning would protect the community in the future. Her mind wandered briefly to her next steps, but she felt a rare peace. The street was alive with activity and hope. The residents had reclaimed their confidence. HOA had been forced to respect the collective voice, and the balance of power had shifted permanently. HOA was no longer the same intimidating force it once had been. Emily and her neighbors had grown stronger, more confident, and more united, but the battle for fairness was ongoing and vigilance was still necessary. Emily spent her mornings walking the streets, observing subtle changes. Residents greeted each other with smiles, children played safely on the sidewalks, and the atmosphere was lighter. HOA had lost much of its oppressive presence, but Emily knew the board could attempt minor manipulations at any time. At home, Emily and Sarah continued to refine their evidence collection. Every old document, every photo, and every recorded conversation was organized in a way that could be presented to authorities if needed. HOA records were no longer just papers, they were tools of accountability. Meanwhile, Mr. Randall and a few remaining board members attempted to project authority during a public meeting. They spoke formally, announcing minor rule clarifications, hoping to regain some influence. HOA residents listened attentively, but their confidence had shifted the balance. The board's words no longer carried the same fear. Emily observed that even small acts of enforcement were now questioned. Residents referenced evidence and documentation, calmly challenging unnecessary fines or ambiguous rules. HOA was being held accountable in real time, and the fear that had once gripped the community was gone. One weekend, Emily organized a neighborhood event, gardening and cleanup day. She encouraged residents to participate and take pride in their community. HOA could no longer dictate participation. The sense of unity was now stronger than any imposed rule. The lavender door of Emily's home had become a symbol of subtle rebellion and individuality. Neighbors smiled at her as they passed, acknowledging her leadership in guiding the community. HOA was still present, but it had been humanized and restrained by transparency, courage, and collective action. As the sun dipped behind the houses, Emily felt a quiet satisfaction. The fight had been long, exhausting, and filled with tension, but meaningful change had occurred. HOA would now operate under scrutiny, and the neighborhood had reclaimed its voice, pride, and freedom. Emily stood on her porch, watching the neighborhood thrive. She knew the journey wasn't completely over, but the residents were now empowered. HOA would have to respect the community's strength or risk losing its influence permanently. HOA was slowly adjusting to the new reality. Emily's neighborhood had transformed from a place of fear into a community of awareness and shared responsibility. But she knew that true vigilance required more than one victory. It required a lasting system of checks and balance. Emily began documenting neighborhood activities, ensuring every decision, meeting, and minor violation was noted. She created a shared digital folder with Sarah, accessible to any resident who wanted to verify information. HOA could no longer act in secret. Meanwhile, the board attempted subtle intimidation, sending reminders about rules and deadlines, hoping to unsettle the residents. Emily calmly reviewed each notice, cross-referencing them with the evidence she had gathered. HOA messages that once caused panic now sparked organized responses. At home, Emily noticed the neighborhood had changed subtly, yet significantly. Residents started organizing informal meetings, checking each other's lawns and houses, and discussing communal improvements independently of HOA. The sense of ownership was growing. One afternoon, Emily met with long-term residents who had been silent witnesses for years. They shared stories of past grievances, adding depth and context to the growing archive of evidence. HOA records now included decades of history that had previously gone unnoticed. Emily realized that empowering neighbors to speak and participate was as important as confronting the board. Workshops on neighborhood rules, landscaping guidelines, and community rights were held in living rooms and backyards. HOA had no authority over this grassroots knowledge sharing. The board held another official meeting, trying to reassert their presence. Emily attended, observing closely. Residents raised questions confidently, using documented evidence to clarify misapplied fines and ambiguous rules. HOA was being guided by transparency, and the balance of authority had shifted permanently. As evening fell, Emily walked past her lavender door, now glowing softly in the sunset. Children played freely, neighbors chatted openly, and the street hummed with life. HOA was still present, but its power was tempered by the vigilance and unity of the community. Emily felt a profound satisfaction. The battle had been long, but it was becoming a lasting change. HOA would now face a neighborhood prepared to question, challenge, and collaborate for fairness. She knew the journey wasn't over, there would always be new challenges, but the residents were empowered, informed, and united. HOA would have to respect this new reality or risk being rendered irrelevant. HOA was now being carefully monitored by the community, but Emily knew that vigilance alone wasn't enough. She wanted to ensure that the changes she and her neighbors had fought for would last indefinitely. She organized another series of community meetings, this time focused on proactive planning. Neighbors discussed how to prevent future abuses and how to make neighborhood life enjoyable while maintaining standards fairly. HOA rules were now interpreted collectively rather than arbitrarily enforced. Emily also encouraged residents to create a communication network, a simple message system where any questionable fines or notices could be shared immediately. HOA would no longer have the opportunity to act in secret. Meanwhile, the board tried minor adjustments, hoping that subtle rule clarifications might reassert their authority. Emily and the residents carefully reviewed each amendment, ensuring transparency and accountability. HOA was being watched and its influence steadily waned. In the evenings, Emily often walked the streets, noting small but meaningful changes. Gardens were being maintained with care, fences repaired, and colorful doors like her lavender one had become accepted expressions of individuality. HOA was present, but it no longer dictated fear or control. One day, Emily received messages of appreciation from neighbors who had regained confidence in standing up for themselves. The community had become self-sustaining. It could enforce fairness without relying on fear or intimidation. HOA had lost its monopoly over authority, replaced by shared vigilance and collaboration. Emily reflected on the journey. The neighborhood had transformed. What was once a place of tension and quiet intimidation had become a space of openness, trust, and empowerment. HOA would now operate with transparency, and residents had a permanent voice in their own community. Walking past her lavender door at sunset, Emily felt a sense of calm accomplishment. The fight had been exhausting but meaningful. HOA would have to respect the collective strength of the neighborhood or risk losing relevance forever. She knew the challenges of community life would continue, but the foundation was solid. Unity, courage, and persistence had reshaped the balance of power. HOA would never again be able to control the neighborhood unchecked. HOA had begun to realize that the residents were no longer intimidated. Emily's leadership had shifted the power balance, but the board quietly explored subtle ways to regain influence. Emily noticed minor notices appearing in mailboxes, warnings about minor landscaping deviations and color choices. She calmly reviewed each one, cross-referencing with the archive she and Sarah had built. HOA was testing boundaries, but the community was ready. Emily organized a small team of neighbors to monitor these notices and respond collectively. Every unjust warning was addressed immediately, with documented proof shared across the community network. HOA could no longer act in secrecy or fear. Meanwhile, a few residents who had been hesitant earlier began speaking up. They shared stories of past fines and abuses, adding depth to the growing body of evidence. Emily encouraged them, emphasizing unity and transparency. HOA was losing its ability to isolate dissenters. The board attempted to hold another meeting, announcing minor rule changes and reinforcing procedures. Emily attended, armed with a detailed presentation showing every prior abuse, backed by neighbor testimonies and documented records. HOA members were visibly tense as residents raised questions confidently. Emily emphasized that fairness and transparency were now the foundation of neighborhood governance. She presented visual charts showing how collective vigilance had already limited arbitrary fines and mismanagement. HOA had to acknowledge the community's strengthened voice. The residents also began proactive measures, community gardening days, street cleanups, and social events. Emily encouraged participation, ensuring that neighbors worked together, reinforcing bonds and collective responsibility. HOA could not control voluntary community engagement. By the evening, Emily walked past her lavender door and saw neighbors laughing, sharing, and working together. The street had transformed into a lively, confident community. HOA was still present but fully restrained, a shadow of its former authority. Emily reflected quietly on the progress. The neighborhood had learned that unity, courage, and meticulous planning could overcome fear and exploitation. HOA would now operate under constant oversight, and residents had reclaimed their voice permanently. HOA was being held accountable more than ever. Emily and the neighbors had created a system of vigilance that left no room for arbitrary decisions or hidden agendas. Emily organized a larger neighborhood meeting, inviting everyone affected by past fines and abuses. The room was filled with determined faces, each ready to share their experiences. HOA members entered with cautious confidence, unaware that their authority had shifted. Residents spoke openly about injustices, unnecessary fines, inconsistent rule enforcement, and favoritism. Emily presented her well-documented evidence, photos, receipts, recordings, and visual charts showing patterns of abuse. HOA could not deny the truth laid before them. The atmosphere shifted. Residents discussed proactive solutions, proposing rules that were fair, transparent, and enforceable without intimidation. Emily guided the discussion, ensuring every voice was heard. HOA was now observing rather than controlling. Meanwhile, smaller victories accumulated. Residents challenged minor notices effectively, relying on documentation and collective support. HOA no longer had the power to impose fear through trivial violations. Community initiatives flourished. Streets were cleaner, gardens were vibrant, and neighbors organized social events, fostering trust and collaboration. Emily watched as her lavender door became a symbol of resilience and individuality. HOA was present, but its role had transformed into oversight, not oppression. By the end of the meeting, an independent committee of residents was formed to oversee fair rule enforcement. HOA was officially being monitored, and residents had a permanent voice in decisions. Emily walked home that evening, observing the lively streets, children playing safely, and neighbors chatting openly. The neighborhood had changed, not just in rules, but in spirit. HOA would have to respect this collective power or face public accountability. She felt a quiet pride. The struggle had been exhausting, but the results were lasting. HOA could no longer dominate. The neighborhood had reclaimed its voice, independence, and confidence. HOA had been transformed. The board could no longer impose arbitrary fines or rules without scrutiny, and the neighborhood had found its collective voice. Emily stood at the center of her street, looking around at the thriving community. Children played freely, neighbors chatted on porches, and vibrant gardens lined the sidewalks. HOA was still present, but its role had shifted from authoritarian to accountable overseer. The final board meeting was scheduled. Emily prepared meticulously, bringing all evidence, documents, and testimonies. Neighbors arrived early, showing solidarity and readiness. HOA members entered, sensing the shift, their confidence replaced with caution. Emily spoke first, calmly and firmly. She outlined every past abuse, every unjust fine, and every hidden agenda. Residents added their voices, reinforcing the narrative of collective vigilance and fairness. HOA could no longer deny or manipulate. Proposals were made for transparent enforcement, a resident committee, and a communication network for reporting issues. The board agreed, realizing that resistance was futile. HOA had been reshaped by the determined community. After the meeting, Emily walked home, her lavender door glowing softly in the evening light. Neighbors waved, children ran past laughing, and a sense of peace filled the street. HOA would no longer be a symbol of fear, but a reminder of accountability and community unity. Emily reflected on the journey. The neighborhood had grown stronger, more connected, and empowered. What had begun as a single violation of her lavender door had turned into a movement for fairness, transparency, and shared responsibility. HOA would now function under the watchful eyes of a united community, and the lessons learned would last for years to come. As the sun set, Emily took a deep breath, proud of what had been achieved. The battle was over, but the spirit of vigilance and unity would continue. HOA would never again dominate the neighborhood unchecked, and the residents had reclaimed their home, their voice, and their confidence. The street was alive, harmonious, and hopeful. Emily smiled at her lavender door one last time that evening. HOA had been defeated not by force but by courage, unity, and relentless determination. The neighborhood had won.